Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about gender lens to creative placemaking. And this work is it's connected to sustainable development, it's connected to placemaking in general. I'm a big advocate for placemaking. And yesterday I described kind of why I think placemaking is so important. But today I'm going to actually look at placemaking from a gender point of view. And I am an urban planner, and my approach to placemaking is to work with artistic and creative producers in place to promote place-type activities. So an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about themes. We see theory up there. These are the general themes that I'm basing my presentation on. Then I will describe my method, which is really data exploration. It's very much using what data resources we have in the United States, so it's going to be for the United States. And then I'm also going to present some results from a survey of artistic and creative producers in Kansas City to see how far you can get by actually surveying artists. And then I have some conclusions for sustainable development based on these statistical results. So, creative placemaking is very much in vogue in the United States right now. And it's because we have this emphasis on creating amenities. And very much it comes out of this idea that if we create amenities, we're going to increase the quality of life and attract high-tech workers, because everyone wants to be high-tech. It's a little crazy, actually, because not everyone can be high-tech. But I am convinced that artistic and creative workers in the information age, they're pushing the boundaries of innovation, because you're dealing with artistic content now on the web. Furthermore, creative production creates the forums for multicultural understanding. So again, as we create heritage sites, and especially when we work instead of just the dominant narrative or the dominant story of bringing up the stories of subcultures, we are increasing communication and understanding among people. And that's a very important project. So yesterday I very much talked about why place. I think place is not well defined. You know, I know it when I see it. But for me, place is all about these reiterative social practices that happen again and again. And that places create identity. So, creative placemaking then is when real estate professionals, planners, other people in the development process partner with artists and creative folk to do a creative activity in place. Sometimes these are temporary, other times they are permanent engagements, sometimes they're actual developments like artist housing or performance spaces or new venues. And I think it's important when we do placemaking to bring up again one of the big themes I brought up yesterday, and that is that we always have to question whether our placemaking process is a place-taking process. Because especially when we're concerned with heritage and historic preservation, we're concerned with placekeeping. And the last thing we want to do is drive people out of a place. So, creative placemaking needs to facilitate placekeeping. And if we do that, we might be able to get to inclusive and transformative development, which it's the end goal of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So, in order to be able to get there, I want to know about the conditions of artistic and creative production right now in my community, in my, again, national context, which is the United States. So, why a gender lens? Well, luckily, the Sustainable Development Goals make it very clear the importance of gender mainstreaming. That's not so true in the United States right now. There's a big need still in the US to achieve gender equality. And I've been asked, why am I looking at this as if it just is? It's like women are naturally drawn to certain things. I don't believe that. So I don't accept that as just the way it is. We need to question those things. I also think that we need to look at, my goal here is to use existing culture and artistic practices and try to raise them up and promote those. And I think I have an argument here that women's activities are less promoted and need actually to be promoted more. There's a literature in planning that's very interesting on gender in planning, and it's not very favorable to the current condition. So that's all the theory. I'm going to delve into some data to kind of make my points. And I'm using 3 data sources. The first is the U.S. American Community Survey. It is the detailed part of the U.S. Census. It is a sample survey that gets to very detailed questions about American life. It's now done every year. So it's a sample, so there's sampling error, as opposed to the U.S. Census, where we interview everyone. But allows me to find information about people whose work people who describe their work as in an artistic occupation or a creative occupation. Now the problem with that is that when people are asked about their work, they're asked about where you made the most money the last year. And lots of artists make some money from art and creative, but they might work another job. And I suspect that's true here. The second source, and this is important because of the, if you read gender theory, a lot of it in the United States gets back down to that if you look at home life, the average American's home life, and this is a heteronormative model, so heterosexual male-female couple with kids, there's still a disproportionate amount of time spent on childcare and housework for women. And those come out in these results. And this is a much more limited survey from the U.S. Population Survey, where they actually had people keep diaries of all their time. And then knowing that, in Kansas City, I know artistic producers, artists, musicians, who don't make their livelihood from their art, but if you ask them what their primary identity is, it's artist. Oh yeah, I work at the coffee shop. But ideally, they would like to work as artists and have that be their livelihood. So again, your profession, your work in life may be different than your job. So because of that, I got funding from a local foundation to actually survey artists and creators in Kansas City. And I did this in cooperation with a proposed artist space in the suburbs of Kansas City. So now I'm just going to describe some of the results. And when you look at these are, and I'm probably going to have to say it at the bottom, I looked at this before, I'm not sure it reads. But compared to all workers, there's not much difference in gender when you look at creative occupations and artistic occupations as a total. There's no difference there. But it's when you get down to the details that you find these differences. And so, looking at creative occupations, and I'm using this occupational approach to artists and creative occupations. I'm following the work of Anne Markuson from about 15 years ago. So here are gender differences in creative occupations. And the total is put there, but if you notice the bars vary. When you get to the detailed occupations, it's all over the place. So in architecture, it's male dominated. When we get to archivists, museum curators, actually conservationists fit in that category. More women than men, which is interesting. Designers, it's a little bit more equal. But when you get to the media, video, equipment workers, very much male dominated. Same sort of phenomena when we look at detailed occupations of artists. So all these are detailed artistic occupations. You think total artists, well, like the painter would be in the fine artist, the next category, artist and related workers. It's like a painter, ceramicist, that sort of thing. Actors and people in the theater, it's different. So in fact, artists tend to be more male dominated, actors slightly less, dancers, primarily women. I don't know what that says. To me, it says something about the male gaze. Musicians, primarily men. When you turn on the radio, I mean, that makes sense to me. It's like I tend to hear, when you just hear music and singing on the radio, it's often more men than women. Writers and authors, more women. Photographers, about the same. So the medium that artists and creative workers are working in is connected to gender. And so if you don't think about the media, and then it's like, wait a minute, I'm trying to produce a new dance site. You should at least know that on average, the dancers, at least as reported, people who are making their full-time livelihood, are generally women. So there is this gender difference in detailed artistic and creative occupations. So I wanted to know more. And I think, and I read the gender literature, and you know that housework and childcare really matter in terms of people's lives when you go and talk to people. So I looked at this American Time Use Survey, and these results, when you get down to an artistic occupation, I just had to use the general category of artist and the general category of creative to compare to all workers, because the pool and the sample gets very, very small. How do you read this? If the line is above, so this table is an aggregate of time spent all week. And so if you think of work, in the United States, we typically work somewhere between 35 and 45 hours a week. Well, so that's like 5 days a week. There are 2 days where you're not working. This is averaged across all 7 days. So the results presented, if the line is higher than the base, women spend more time. If it's lower than the base, women spend less time. And the key here, and then it's these categories of time use. And the categories of time use, the first one is caring for household members. And then workers are in blue, creatives are in orange, and artists are in gray. And so women, these are the results for women. Women spend more time, women workers, and again, I'm not including women who spend time at home taking care of their kids. The homemaker profession, which is dominated by women, it's something 95% of homemakers are women, only 5% of men that choose to stay at home and do family care and house care, housework. So what this shows is that actually artists or women spend less time than artist men on childcare. That's actually kind of interesting. But what it also shows is that women artists, which the last category all the way at the end is time spent on work. Women, workers, generally spend less time at work in the blue. Women creatives generally spend less time at work. But women artists spend more time. And if you look across household activities, that's housework. Again, the inequity still comes up. Now this survey is from, I think, 2015. I've got to double check that. And again, so these differences are kind of across the board. We still have differences in how we use time. And then, so the response is, well, it really gets down to parenting. And so I compared artist parents to non-artist parents in terms of their use of time. And I found that here, women artists who were not parents spent 2 hours more at work. So it's kind of the story of, in terms of gender equity, that women have to work 2 hours more to get to the same place. And then when children come along, though, women artists work less. And all of a sudden, household activity goes up. So we tend to think of artists as bohemian, as people who buck the general culture. Well, these results are kind of showing that. But then parenting kind of reestablishes the gender-based roles. So this has an impact in trying to create creative placemaking partnerships. Finally, I was interested in saying, well, what if I compared artist parents to worker parents in general? And artist parents, women artist parents have a greater decline in the amount of time being able to be spent on their work. So already now, I've shown that there is this gender difference in particular artistic and creative practice by medium. Again, for people who report their occupation. And then I also show that artists have different patterns. Women artists have different patterns of time use than women workers in general. So the next question then is, well, what about, I need to find out about not just the workers whose primary occupation is an artist. I want to know about artists, people who self-define as artists or creatives. And so we did the survey, we had 280 responses. Is that, the real question about how representative the survey is. So it's representative of the respondents. And so the results I'm finding are probably fairly representative of artists in Kansas City. However, you'll see that this is percent of the total respondents who actually work in a particular artistic or creative practice. And so out of 280, I had 3.6% were working in architecture. Kansas City is a big architecture town. So that could be higher. But you notice, I know that in Kansas City that we mirror the national trend, and that typically two-thirds to three-fourths of architects in Kansas City are men. So we're almost over representing women in this survey compared to the actual. So we captured that participation in all of these artistic and creative mediums. So here, to read it off, so in case you can't read it: architecture, archive and curation, art, working in an art gallery, arts administration, arts advocacy, arts education, arts therapy, ceramics, computer multimedia, crafts, culinary arts, although we had lots of discussion about including that, dance and choreography, design, fiber arts, folk and traditional art. We had no one who worked in foundry. I only know of like 4 sculptors in Kansas City that do that. So I think we had 2 respondents who worked in glass, graphic arts, jewelry making, mixed media, music, painting and drawing, performance, photography, printmaking, sculpture, storytelling, theater, video, film, woodworking, and writing. So a pretty comprehensive list of artistic and creative categories. And how I report the results in the survey, I only report, so all of the results are in blue. These are percent of total reporting this. You could report more than one medium, because most artists I know or talk to work not just in paint, but they do paint and multimedia, or they're a painter who also has an art gallery job. So the respondents were allowed to report, I think, up to 5 categories. So again, in this, I'm only reporting results in orange. It's when results from women artists were significantly different than the results as a whole. So these are only the differences. So when you don't see an orange line, the results for women were about the same in height. So I summarized those artistic practices into my own summary categories. So arts presentation, women generally were more likely to work in arts presentation, less likely to work in design, less likely to work in performing arts, more likely to work in crafts, more likely to work in fine arts. And then parents actually showed up as a category, looking in film and digital multimedia. So then, I looked at job status. And again, in the results here, 1/3 of our artists in the survey fit the definition of the previous 2 surveys, where their occupation would have been full-time artist. 2/3 of my respondents, people who define themselves as artistic or creative producers, don't fit that definition. So the official statistics are missing an awful lot of creative activity. Now, they're probably not missing the people who are making the most money, because they can be full-time artists. But again, if you want to, I don't measure artistic success by money, partly because I've seen that some of the greatest artistic and creative producers were not successful during their lifetimes. We only find them afterward or at some later point. So women were much more likely to have a part-time job. This kind of fits a sort of story of women's livelihoods in Kansas City, and it correlates then to artistic and creative production. I also looked at business incorporation, and I found no difference by gender. Interestingly, there's some differences for parents. Parents were much more likely to be sole proprietors. You know, I'm beginning to see that there might be a category of artistic or creative producer who's working at home and taking care of the kids, and also produces art as part of their livelihood. I asked about income, which is always hard to get people to, in a regular survey, to talk about their income, at least in the United States. My results here, so all artists are on one side, and the categories here are blue is very low, orange is very much a medium, it's blue is less than 10%, gray is 75% or more, and this is household income from art. So I live with my partner, we have two incomes, those two incomes are our household income. So women artists were much more likely to have less than 10% of their income from art in their household. Now it may be that they're making money from their art, but that someone else in their household makes a lot more money. So this leads to the question, well, how do you finance your artistic and creative practice? And so the categories here, in case you can't see it, it's by sales of art, art performances, grants, art consulting, art teaching, personal savings, through partner's income, or through non-art employment. And we found that actually there weren't that many differences by gender in how people were financing their art careers. Lots of differences by parent status. Parent status were generally more likely to take advantage of grants, consulting, less likely to be art teaching, and less likely to be using savings. And again, the parents I know, they would laugh. It's like, what, save? When you're raising kids? I also asked about studio status, because again, this is probably the planner in me. I'm always interested in development of physical space, either preserving, finding reuse. And again, my partner in this was an artist developing an artist space in suburban Kansas City. And so we were asking artists and creatives about their studio. And the majority of artists had their studio, or the largest category, had their studio at home. What was interesting is that parents were less likely to have their studio at home. Distraction. We asked about studio space, which is important for what the needs are in developing artist space. And women artists, again, this is blue, orange, and gray is by size of space. Women artists reported needs for smaller spaces. I don't know what those results indicate, if that's connected to medium or to psychology of space. Finally, we looked at interest in developing programs for the artists because we want this activity in our locations. And so part of generating in creative placemaking, part of it is to provide services to the artists with the idea of happier artists, more activity, and you get the resulting increase in quality of life and amenities. Women artists tended to want more interactive activities connected to their profession. And I see this as kind of connected to this, to the time use study, where I found that women artists were more likely to spend 2 hours more a week on their work. I got this image of women artists having to work harder and then needing more interactive professional activity, whereas men just go and do it. So now I'm going to back out of these detailed data to kind of summarize what I think the findings are, and then conclude with some policies. I think I've showed that artists and creative occupations are deeply gendered. And I think I showed that at both the national and local level. So when you're developing a creative placemaking partnership, you just should be aware of that. In fact, you could develop your partnership to kind of address those gender inequalities. Women artists work more. It's kind of funny because in grad school we always joke that women professors work twice as hard. And it's like, wait a minute, these results are kind of showing that. Parenting really impacts work and practice. And that artists and creatives have other jobs. I think, at least in the United States, in Kansas City, creative practice doesn't pay. So anything we can do to make it pay is going to be it's going to have the results we want. There are real studio needs for artists. And we've got to figure out ways of these place-based interaction, creating policies where women artists are getting kind of the professional interaction that they're asking for. So backing out now to sustainable development in general, these sort of overall policies, I think to do creative placemaking, we definitely need to expand partnerships with women art and creative producers because of this inequity. That there's real need for development of studio space and these spaces of interaction. That if we think, so 2/3 of artists are not counted in the official counts, that means they're doing this work, and the more that our policies can bring their work out, that's already existing. It's a placekeeping process. So a policy, again, would be attention to childcare, which is a big need in the United States. European countries do a much better job. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Agradecemos a Michael. ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
I wanted to know, where did you place the survey? How did the people come and answer this? No?
So we used a snowball sampling method via email, and then we produced cards, the same size as the cards yesterday, about half of the sheet, and we placed them around coffee shops, galleries, performance venues, and that said, take the Kansas City Artist Survey, and they went to the web. We also went to certain venues with paper copies almost everyone, I think we had 4 completed surveys by paper and 276 surveys by the web. Now, now the latest survey I'm doing is all on I can do it on cell phones. So it gets to, when you're thinking about your target audience, you've got to think about what's the best way to reach them. The 4 surveys that were on paper were at an event that was targeted toward minority artists. So very much probably were some of the lowest income artists participating in the survey. So that's a sign of bias. It's a good question.
And how many were women and how many were men?
I think it's 280 and then it was 180, so the majority were women. And it's actually, when I've looked at the results, I could have shown you the results on the occupational side for Kansas City for context. And Kansas City, it switches, it's 43% nationally of artists are women in the United States. Occupationally in Kansas City, it's 53. So it is a little bit more. I don't know if that's, we're not known, we are known as a mid-continent art center, but we're not known as an art center nationally. We're fine in the arts as it goes, but art and creative occupations, where's a creative center in the United States? It's New York, Los Angeles, Santa Fe, actually, New Mexico, in terms of folk art. Nashville in terms of music. So we are not one of those, which in some ways our results are more generalizable to most of the United States.
Gracias. Quería preguntar, ¿cómo situarías este estudio que se hace acerca de género en las políticas de sustentabilidad?
A ver, lo ver así como
How would you situate this study you have made for policies for sustainability? Because, for example, in Mexico, I work at archaeological sites, and then I hire as well women and men for collaborating on the work, people from the local communities, and we have the same problem. Well, not the problem. I can observe the same things. Women work twice. They come and work with us, and then they go back home and they prepare the food for the men that also work with us. So how can we? I try to get an equal team, half men, half women, but then I know that the women will be working twice than the men. So how do you situate this?
So this is a structural, cultural practice.
Yeah.
And that breaking that down, I think, you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and addressing gender inequality is a fundamental goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think industrialized countries always say, oh, we don't need to do that. That's really for the non-industrialized countries. And they think of these very gendered societies, more gendered than ours. But in fact, these practices are still going on. So I think you have to raise them and create strategic interventions, like perhaps asking the men to prepare at work or prepare a meal, or just do something to kind of break the mold, or even, once, this is really a work in progress. This is a paper I'm presenting at the planning meetings in a week. But once this work is out there, you can reference it and have a discussion and bring it up and have people talk about what they're doing in their lives, and then begin seeing where some changes can happen. But the structure is hard to change, because this takes, it's both individual But then, you know, I'm calling for attention to childcare. We don't have, so in Kansas City, childcare is early childhood education. It's about having full-day preschool, so that actually having that start a little bit earlier, which then addresses the fact that women are in the workforce now, but we haven't done that yet. And it makes a big impact in terms of poverty. Because, you know, each of these sustainable development goals connect to each other. In terms of, you know, work at a heritage site, I think this work is very much applied to the activity around it. That the heritage site work is important. And it's up, if you're working at a heritage site, you can address gender equity when you're in a position of management. But it's trying to generate these auxiliary activities that kind of go with a heritage site in tourism. That's often a way that we make money to support heritage sites. And that tourism then funds the important education activity that happens from our sites. So these creative placemaking activities get to the live-in culture in and around these areas and create the district on a plan level. It's very much intelligent, this urban planning approach to this.
I wanted to know if this gender bias was something that people that were surveyed perceived, or is it just normalized as it usually is? And if the results came as a surprise for you, or if you had an hypothesis about what the results would be, and if they matched it?
So I thought there was going to be a difference in business and corporation. And the funding for the survey was from the Kauffman Foundation for Entrepreneurship. And I found, well, you know, gender was one of the underlying questions. We were looking at artist livelihoods and the factors for entrepreneurship, and I was shocked I had a negative finding there. So is that kind of an example? I went in not knowing, I wanted to know what it would show. I suspected that folks who, if you're not reporting your art or creative work as your occupation, you're probably not making your livelihood, your money from the art, because that gets into the definitional category of the national surveys. It's like, in what occupation did you make the most money in the last year? I think it could be a direct quote. Which doesn't serve art or creative work, because, you know, the point of being an artist, I mean, it would be great to make money. But when I talk to artists, they do it because of something else. A need to produce. A need to have a say, a need to... It's connected to their internal identity. It's connected that art and creative production, you know, there's intrinsic value. There's aesthetic value that doesn't come out in what something sells for, not which would be used, you know, different ways of valuing things.
¿Alguna pregunta?
Talking about crafts, for example, in Mexico, there are many categories, and pottery, women are more, but I know in waxery, men are more. Would you please share us more examples about crafts in Kansas, please?
What are the examples of crafts in Kansas? So this woman didn't answer my survey, but there's someone who, this is a little bit mean. she makes these angels. And she used to work, so a company that's in town that used to employ a lot of commercial artists is Hallmark. You know, the greeting card company? And they produce decor, little tchotchkes. And she produced these angels on her own. After she left Hallmark, she produced these. And she actually had her own company and has now, I have found these and I've gone to friends' homes in England, and there on the mantle is one of her pieces. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's from Kansas City. So that's the most successful story, and that's just, it's like there's like 3 or 4 people who've done that. But it's the same, a lot of these crafts are home crafts. There is a Native American population in greater Kansas City, so some of the crafts come directly out of an ethnic culture, but a lot of them don't. We have the Kansas City Art Institute that has a big fiber arts program. So there's a fair amount of folks doing, weaving, producing textiles, but they're not necessarily making a living from it. So it's a wide variety of these things. You see it so we have art fairs and multiple art fairs during the year and in different locations of the region. And these are not world-class, the artists that get written up and go to New York and show. But they are artists who are working in crafts, drawing various things, and they are selling their wares. And it's somewhat juried, too, these art fairs. So you have to have a portfolio to get in. So it's raising the culture of it. But, it's hard to have this high art, low art distinction of that. I mean, I think museum curators can do that because they are so well trained. But I mean, it almost takes 30 years before we know that, wait a minute, that's really significant. We didn't really see it at the time, like any art and creative production. It's hard to say what's being done now. I mean, some things we know about because they have such an impact on us, but we don't really know until kind of a generation that was an important moment. So does that answer it?
¿Alguna otra pregunta?